Welcome to NapLab. Across the surface of the Earth, long before cities, roads, or written history, vast forests quietly shaped the planet. These forests did not hurry. They grew slowly, layer by layer, season by season, learning how to exist through patience rather than speed. An ancient forest is not simply a collection of trees. It is a living system built over centuries. Every trunk, every root, every layer of soil carries memory. Time moves differently here. Growth is measured in decades, sometimes in hundreds of years. At the highest level, the forest canopy filters sunlight into soft fragments. Leaves absorb energy with calm efficiency, converting light into life without noise or urgency. The forest does not rush toward the sun. It waits and the sun arrives. Below the canopy, air moves slowly. Wind loses its strength as it passes through branches, becoming a gentle motion rather than a force. This softened air regulates temperature, creating a stable environment where extremes are rare and balance is preserved. Tree trunks rise vertically, not competing aggressively, but adjusting their shapes to available space. Some grow straight and tall, others curve gently, responding to light, gravity, and neighboring growth. The forest does not demand uniformity. Variation is not a flaw here, it is a strategy. Beneath the surface, roots extend outward in all directions. They do not exist in isolation. Roots connect with fungi, forming vast underground networks known as mycorrhizal systems. Through these networks, nutrients are exchanged, signals are transmitted, and stress is communicated. This underground system is sometimes described as the forest's quiet intelligence. When one tree experiences drought, others may reduce their own intake. When nutrients are abundant in one area, they are shared. No central control exists, yet coordination emerges naturally. Fallen leaves accumulate on the forest floor, forming a soft, insulating layer. This layer slows decay, protects moisture, and feeds countless microorganisms. Nothing here is wasted. What falls eventually returns as nourishment. Time in an ancient forest feels expanded. Seasons repeat, but never identically. Spring arrives with gradual certainty. Growth resumes slowly, deliberately. Summer stabilizes the system, allowing energy to circulate calmly. Autumn releases matter back into the soil. Winter rests without resistance. Animals move through this environment without disrupting it. Their paths follow patterns established long ago. Predators and prey maintain equilibrium not through dominance, but through limitation. Excess is corrected naturally without intervention. Sound behaves differently in the forest. High frequencies are absorbed by foliage. Sharp noises fade quickly. What remains are low, continuous tones. Distant wind, subtle movement, occasional calls softened by distance. Silence here is not empty. It is full of quiet information. Ancient trees often carry scars, burn marks, broken limbs, hollowed centers. These signs are not weaknesses. They are records of survival. The tree continues growing around damage, integrating disruption rather than resisting it. Carbon is stored patiently within wood fibers, locked away for centuries. In this way, forests stabilize the atmosphere without effort or awareness. Balance emerges not from intention, but from structure. As years pass, new growth rises among the old. Saplings develop in the shade, adapting to limited light. They grow slowly, conserving energy, preparing for opportunities that may arrive decades later. Nothing here expects immediacy. When a large tree finally falls, it does not represent an ending. Light reaches the forest floor, seeds awaken, fungi expand. The system reorganizes itself calmly without loss of direction. An ancient forest does not strive to be efficient in the modern sense. It values resilience over speed, continuity over output. Its intelligence is distributed, quiet, and deeply stable. This is a system that functions without awareness of observation. It does not perform. It simply continues. And it has been doing so for longer than memory. Over very long periods of time, ancient forests begin to influence not only the land beneath them, but the climate above them. Moisture released slowly through leaves rises into the air, contributing to cloud formation far beyond the forest's boundaries. This process happens continuously without pause, shaping regional weather patterns in ways that are subtle and cumulative. Rain that falls onto the forest canopy does not immediately reach the ground. It moves gradually, guided by leaves, branches, and bark. Some evaporates before touching soil. Some travels down trunks in thin streams, feeding roots directly. By the time water enters the ground, it has already been filtered, slowed, and distributed. Soil in an ancient forest is layered like a quiet archive. The top layer is loose and dark, rich with organic material from centuries of decay. Beneath it, denser layers hold minerals and moisture. Each layer supports different forms of life, each operating at its own pace. Microorganisms dominate this environment. Bacteria, fungi, and microscopic invertebrates work constantly, breaking down complex matter into simpler forms. Their activity never stops, but it is never hurried. Chemical reactions unfold steadily, regulated by temperature, moisture, and time. Fungi play a central role. Their networks extend far beyond individual trees, connecting entire sections of the forest. These networks do not think, yet their behavior resembles decision-making. Resources move towards scarcity. Growth avoids resistance. Balance emerges without direction. Seeds lie dormant for years, sometimes decades. They wait beneath leaf litter, protected from light and temperature extremes. Germination is not triggered by desire, but by alignment, when moisture, warmth, and space coincide. Many seeds never grow, and the forest does not regard this as failure. Light reaches the forest floor in patterns that change slowly over the day. Morning light enters at a shallow angle, illuminating specific areas. By afternoon, shadows shift. Over years, these patterns influence which plants survive and which fade away. Some plants adapt to constant shade. Their leaves are broad and thin, optimized for limited light. Others depend on brief exposure, growing rapidly after a tree falls and a gap opens above them. This dynamic creates quiet cycles of opportunity and restraint. Animals contribute without dominating. Large mammals create paths that compact soil slightly, altering water flow. Insects pollinate, consume, and redistribute energy. Birds carry seeds across distances, extending the forest's reach beyond its physical edge. Predation maintains balance. No species multiplies without consequence. Excess leads to correction. Scarcity leads to adaptation. These processes unfold over generations, not moments. Ancient forests experience disturbance. Fires pass through, sometimes intense, sometimes mild. Rather than ending the system, fire resets certain processes. Some seeds require heat to open. Nutrients locked in would return to the soil. Recovery begins immediately, though visibly it appears slow. Ice ages arrive and retreat. Forests migrate across continents over thousands of years. Species shift their ranges gradually, following temperature and moisture. What seems stationary is, in reality, always moving, just at a scale beyond daily perception. Tree rings record this history. Each ring marks a year of growth, influenced by rainfall, temperature, and available light. Narrow rings indicate hardship. Wide rings suggest abundance. Together, they form a timeline written in wood. Old trees become habitats themselves. Cavities form, providing shelter. Moss and lichen colonize bark, creating microenvironments. Life accumulates rather than replaces. When a tree finally collapses, it becomes a nurse log. New plants grow from its decaying surface. In death, structure remains. Function continues. Nothing in an ancient forest seeks permanence, yet continuity persists. The system survives by yielding rather than resisting. Change is absorbed, not opposed. The forest does not remember in the human sense. Still, Its structure carries the imprint of everything that has passed through it. Time is stored in form, in spacing, in composition. This slow intelligence does not announce itself. It does not accelerate. It does not correct abruptly. It simply continues, patient and unbroken. As centuries pass, the structure of an ancient forest becomes increasingly complex. Layers multiply, interactions deepen, and stability increases. This complexity does not create noise. Instead, it absorbs disturbance, distributing its effects across time and space. Wind interacts with the forest in measured ways. At the canopy level, branches sway and dissipate force. Lower down, trunks remain mostly still. Near the ground, movement is barely perceptible. Energy is reduced gradually, never abruptly. Temperature fluctuations are softened. During hot periods, shade and evaporation limit extremes. During cold periods, dense vegetation retains warmth. The forest acts as a slow regulator, moderating conditions without effort. Moisture cycles repeat endlessly. Dew forms on leaves during cool nights, then evaporates as temperatures rise. Fog drifts through low areas, condensing on surfaces before lifting away. These small exchanges contribute to long-term equilibrium. Chemical processes unfold beneath awareness. Nitrogen is fixed by bacteria, transformed into usable forms. Phosphorus moves slowly through soil layers. Carbon flows between atmosphere, biomass, and ground, rarely escaping the system entirely. Trees communicate stress indirectly. When attacked by insects, some release chemical signals into the air. Nearby trees respond by strengthening their own defenses. This exchange is subtle and limited, yet effective over time. Growth rates vary widely. Some species invest in rapid vertical growth, reaching light quickly but living briefly. Others grow slowly, strengthening internal structures, extending lifespan. Both strategies persist, neither dominating completely. Deadwood accumulates intentionally, not as neglect but as necessity. It retains moisture, supports fungi, shelters insects. Removal would disrupt cycles refined over millennia. The forest floor remains uneven. Small mounds, depressions, and fallen trunks shape microclimates. Seeds settle into protected spaces. Water collects where soil allows. Diversity emerges from irregularity. Insects operate on scales too small to notice individually. Collectively, they shape the forest. They aerate soil, recycle matter, regulate populations. Their lifespans are brief, but their impact is continuous. Birdsong marks territory and time. Calls differ by height, density, and season. Sound travels differently depending on humidity and foliage. Each note fades into the larger acoustic field. Large predators maintain distance from human concepts of dominance. They regulate movement and distribution. Prey species adjust behavior accordingly, altering grazing patterns and migration routes. Over thousands of years, genetic variation accumulates. Traits suited to local conditions persist. Others disappear quietly. Evolution proceeds without direction, guided only by compatibility with environment. Storms occasionally remove entire sections of forest. Recovery begins immediately at microscopic levels. Fungi expand. Seeds germinate. Growth resumes, slow but assured. Human presence, when minimal, integrates into these systems. Paths become part of the terrain. Structures decay and return to soil. When pressure increases, imbalance appears, but the forest responds where possible. Time remains the dominant factor. Processes overlap and repeat, creating continuity. No single event defines the forest. Meaning emerges only in accumulation. Ancient forests do not optimize for productivity. They optimize for survival across uncertainty. Redundancy is common. Efficiency is secondary. This creates resilience. When one pathway fails, others continue. When conditions change, adaptation unfolds gradually. Nothing here requires awareness of its role. Function exists without intention. Order forms without design. The forest persists because it yields, adjusts, and continues. Over longer spans of time, ancient forests begin to influence the shape of the land itself. Roots stabilize soil on slopes, slowing erosion. Leaf litter cushions rainfall, preventing rapid runoff. Streams that pass through forests flow more evenly, less prone to sudden flooding or drying. Water paths adjust gradually. Small channels form and disappear. Sediment settles slowly, creating fertile banks. Over centuries, these subtle adjustments shape valleys and wetlands. Forests interact with fire in complex ways. Low-intensity fires clear undergrowth without harming large trees. High-intensity fires occur rarely but restructure entire regions. Both are absorbed into the forest's long-term rhythm. Some trees carry adaptations specifically for fire. Thick bark insulates vital tissues. Cones remain closed until heat releases seeds. Fire becomes not a threat but a phase. In colder regions, forests endure heavy snow. Branches bend rather than break. Snow accumulates, insulating roots from extreme cold. Meltwater feeds soil slowly in spring, extending moisture availability. Glacial periods reshape forests dramatically. Ice advances, erasing ecosystems. When it retreats, forests return gradually, following newly formed soils. Species migrate from refuges, repopulating landscapes over millennia. Forest boundaries are never fixed. Edges expand and contract with climate shifts. Grasslands become woodlands. Woodlands return to grasslands. These transitions occur slowly enough to appear stable within a human lifetime. Soil memory accumulates. Nutrients from past generations remain embedded. Chemical signatures persist long after original vegetation changes. The land remembers even when the forest moves on. Some organisms exist only in ancient forests. Their life cycles depend on old trees, deep shade, or decaying wood. These species do not adapt quickly. They persist through continuity rather than flexibility. Fungal diversity increases with age. Complex communities establish themselves over centuries. Their interactions become stable, resistant to disturbance. Tree crowns overlap and interlock, forming continuous canopies. Gaps appear only through collapse or disturbance. Light distribution becomes predictable, reinforcing established patterns. The forest becomes self-maintaining. Inputs and outputs balance. Loss is matched by growth. Energy cycles internally. In this state, change is slow enough to feel absent. Yet nothing remains static. Small variations accumulate. Long-term trends emerge quietly. Ancient forests operate on scales that exceed immediate observation. Their intelligence lies in duration rather than speed. They respond not to moments but to eras. What survives here is not the strongest or fastest, but what fits into the long rhythm of the system. The forest continues not because it resists change but because it incorporates it. As ancient forests mature further, their internal rhythms become increasingly synchronized. Processes that once appeared independent begin to align through repetition and time. Growth, decay, movement, and rest overlap in patterns that stabilize the whole. Morning arrives gradually beneath the canopy. Light increases without sharp transition. Temperatures rise slowly, allowing organisms to adjust without stress. Activity begins in subtle ways. Microscopic motion, chemical exchange, gentle circulation of AIR.AT midday, energy input reaches its peak. Photosynthesis operates steadily across millions of leaves. Excess heat is dispersed through evaporation. The forest neither accumulates nor releases energy abruptly. Balance is maintained continuously. Evening settles without clear boundary. Shadows lengthen, sounds soften, and activity shifts downward into the soil. Respiration replaces growth as the dominant process. Stored energy circulates quietly. Night introduces another phase. Moisture condenses. Temperatures equalize. Many organisms become inactive while others emerge. The system remains active, but at reduced intensity. Over decades, these daily cycles imprint themselves onto structure. Tree forms reflect prevailing light angles. Soil composition reflects repeated moisture patterns. Everything becomes adapted to the expected rhythm. Longevity introduces memory without awareness. Structures persist that were shaped by conditions long past. A tree growing today may still reflect light patterns from centuries earlier, when the canopy was arranged differently. Species interactions stabilize. Competitive relationships soften. Mutual dependencies increase. Organisms rely on the predictable presence of others rather than constant adaptation. This predictability reduces energy expenditure. Less effort is required to survive. Efficiency emerges not from optimization but from familiarity. Disturbance still occurs, but its impact is absorbed. When a tree falls, the surrounding system adjusts gradually. No single loss destabilizes the whole. The forest accumulates redundancy. Multiple species fulfill similar roles. If one declines, others compensate. This overlap ensures continuity across uncertainty. Nutrients circulate slowly. Surpluses are stored rather than expended. Scarcity is met with reduction, not collapse. The forest pace remains unchanged regardless of external urgency. It does not respond to short-term pressure. It responds only to sustained patterns. Human time feels compressed by comparison. What appears slow is simply aligned to a different scale. Events measured in decades are brief interruptions here. Ancient forests persist by extending processes beyond individual lifespans. What matters is not survival of a single tree, but continuation of structure. The system does not aim to expand indefinitely. It maintains equilibrium within available space and resources. Growth slows naturally as limits are reached. Excess is trimmed through decay. Balance is preserved. This slow intelligence does not anticipate the future. It endures through consistency. The forest remains not fixed but steady. Over centuries, ancient forests become increasingly quiet, not in the absence of sound but in the absence of urgency. Movement slow as stability deepens. Processes that once fluctuated widely now remain within narrow ranges. Soil respiration continues at a measured pace. Oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange steadily through porous layers. Moisture remains balanced, neither saturating nor drying completely. Extremes are rare. Roots thicken and intertwine. Structural support increases underground, unseen but essential. The forest becomes anchored not just physically but functionally. Change requires sustained pressure to take effect. Canopy gaps become predictable. When old trees weaken, surrounding growth adjusts gradually, redistributing light and nutrients. Collapse is anticipated structurally long before it occurs. Some trees cease vertical growth entirely, investing instead in internal reinforcement. Rings become denser. Growth slows but stability increases. These trees persist through resistance to stress rather than avoidance. The forest's energy budget stabilizes. Input and output align closely. Excess production is stored in wood, soil, and organic matter. Deficits are buffered by reserves accumulated long ago. Insects synchronize life cycles with seasonal signals. Emergence aligns with temperature and light rather than calendar. Population peaks rise and fall gently, never overwhelming the system. Fungi regulate decomposition rates. Material breaks down slowly enough to sustain life, quickly enough to prevent accumulation. Balance remains intact. Water tables remain steady. Forest cover reduces evaporation during dry periods and enhances infiltration during wet ones. Streams flow consistently, maintaining downstream ecosystems. Over time, the forest influences surrounding regions. Climate moderation extends beyond its borders. Moisture, temperature, and wind patterns shift subtly in response to long-standing presence. Boundaries soften. Transitions between forest and non-forest become gradual rather than abrupt. Ecotones form, supporting diverse life adapted to intermediate conditions. Evolution slows. Strong selective pressures diminish as stability increases. Variation persists, but dramatic change becomes less frequent. Survival favors compatibility over innovation. Ancient forests become archives of biological history. Genetic lineages persist longer. Extinction rates decline within stable interiors. The system becomes increasingly difficult to disrupt. Disturbance must be intense and prolonged to overcome accumulated resilience. Yet nothing becomes permanent. Change continues at a pace aligned with geological time rather than immediate perception. When external conditions shift slowly, the forest adapts quietly. Species composition adjusts over generations. Structure transforms without collapse. What defines the ancient forest is not age alone, but continuity. The uninterrupted flow of process matters more than individual elements. The forest exists as an ongoing condition rather than a fixed state. It continues because nothing within it demands conclusion. As time extends beyond centuries into millennia, ancient forests begin to align more closely with geological processes. Soil formation, rock weathering, and biological activity merge into a single, continuous transformation. Minerals released from stone enter the biological cycle. Roots penetrate fractures, widening them slowly. Water seeps into newly opened spaces, accelerating change at an almost imperceptible rate. Organic acids from decaying matter alter soil chemistry. Over long periods, these subtle reactions reshape entire landscapes. What once was bare rock becomes fertile ground through accumulation rather than force. The forest floor deepens. Layers thicken. Compression increases. Older material sinks slowly, preserved in low oxygen zones. Carbon becomes locked away for extended periods. Some trees stand long enough to witness multiple climatic shifts. Their growth patterns adapt incrementally, recording environmental change ring by ring. These records remain embedded even after the tree returns to soil. Population turnover slows. Long-lived species dominate. Short-lived organisms continue to cycle rapidly, but within stable frameworks defined by older structures. Nutrient pathways become highly integrated. Loss through leaching is minimized. Recycling efficiency increases without conscious optimization. Fire regimes settle into predictable intervals. Recovery patterns repeat with minor variation. Memory exists in structure rather than awareness. Hydrological stability deepens. Floodplains develop slowly. Wetlands persist, regulated by forest cover and soil capacity. Ancient forests act as long-term buffers against environmental fluctuation. They do not prevent change, but they delay and soften its impact. When climates warm gradually, species shift upward in elevation or latitude. When cooling occurs, cold-tolerant species regain ground. Movement is slow enough to avoid collapse. The forest's presence alters atmospheric composition subtly but persistently. Carbon storage, oxygen production, and moisture cycling interact over extended periods. Silence deepens. Not through absence but through familiarity. Sounds blend into background patterns that rarely surprise. Even large disturbances become absorbed over time. Earthquakes, volcanic ash, and prolonged drought leave marks, but continuity resumes. Ancient forests rarely reach an endpoint. They transition, migrate, or transform but do not conclude. What appears eternal is simply well aligned with time. The forest remains because it changes slowly enough to endure. Over very long durations, ancient forests begin to merge conceptually with the land they occupy. The distinction between living system and terrain becomes increasingly subtle. Soil is no longer merely beneath the forest. It is part of it. Layers of decomposed material compress and mineralize. Organic matter transforms slowly into stable compounds. These compounds persist long after surface vegetation shifts. Roots penetrate deeper strata. Some reach groundwater, drawing moisture upward through transpiration. This vertical movement of water redistributes minerals and stabilizes surface conditions. Forest influence extends downward. Subsurface temperatures become more constant. Seasonal variation diminishes with depth. Stability increases with distance from the surface. Above ground, canopy architecture evolves to minimize internal stress. Branch angles adjust gradually. Load distribution becomes efficient through time rather than design. Trees no longer grow simply in response to light. They grow in response to history. Structural forms reflect accumulated adaptation to past storms, snowfall, and drought. Species composition shifts slowly. New arrivals integrate without displacement. Older species retreat gradually. Transitions overlap rather than replace. The forest develops internal inertia. Change requires sustained pressure over long periods. Short-term disturbances leave little trace. Microclimates stabilize further. Temperature gradients soften. Humidity remains consistent. Extremes rarely penetrate deeply. Nutrient pools become buffered. Deficiency in one area is compensated elsewhere. Movement occurs through established pathways. Biological rhythms slow. Lifespans lengthen. Reproductive cycles become less frequent but more reliable. The forest's presence modifies surrounding hydrology. Watersheds adjust. Rivers downstream flow more evenly across seasons. Even the chemistry of rainfall changes. Air passing through the forest picks up moisture and organic compounds. Precipitation reflects this influence. Over millennia, these cumulative effects reshape regions. Forests influence where deserts do not form, where rivers persist, where soil remains fertile. The system does not recognize its influence. It exerts it continuously without intent. Ancient forests do not seek to endure. They endure because nothing within them demands speed. Continuity remains the defining condition. As ancient forests persist through extended spans of time, their internal balance becomes increasingly subtle. The most influential processes are no longer visible on the surface. They occur slowly beneath layers of growth and decay, beyond immediate perception. Chemical gradients stabilize within the soil. Nutrients move predictably through established channels. Losses are minimal. Retention becomes the norm. Microbial communities reach equilibrium. Population sizes fluctuate within narrow limits. Sudden expansions are rare. Cooperation outweighs competition as stability deepens. The forest structure absorbs sound more completely. Sharp noises fade quickly. Low-frequency vibrations travel farther but lose intensity. Acoustic space becomes smooth and continuous. Air circulation slows. Wind rarely penetrates deeply. Gases mix gently beneath the canopy, maintaining consistent composition. The forest no longer reacts strongly to individual events. Rainfall, drought, temperature shifts, all are filtered through accumulated resilience. Effects are delayed, reduced, and distributed. Tree mortality becomes gradual. Large trees weaken slowly over decades. Surrounding vegetation adjusts long before collapse occurs. Space is prepared in advance. Light availability changes subtly as branches reposition over time. Growth responds without urgency. No sudden competition emerges. Species coexistence increases. Dominance becomes less pronounced. Ecological roles overlap extensively, creating redundancy. The forest's pace becomes self-reinforcing. Slow processes favor structures that support slowness. Rapid change becomes increasingly incompatible. Even genetic drift slows as population structures stabilize. Variation persists, but extreme divergence becomes less likely. The system approaches a state of dynamic stillness. Motion continues, but without visible acceleration or deceleration. Ancient forests do not settle into stasis. They remain active, but their activity aligns so closely with time that it appears motionless. This alignment is not perfection. It is compatibility. The forest continues because it moves at the same speed as the forces shaping it. Over the longest spans of time, ancient forests begin to resemble processes more than places. Their identity is no longer tied to specific trees or species, but to the continuity of relationships that persist despite change. Individual organisms come and go. What remains is pattern. The arrangement of space, the timing of cycles, the distribution of energy, all persist beyond replacement. Forest interiors become increasingly insulated from external variability. Sudden climate events register faintly, if at all. The system responds only to sustained trends. Tree spacing stabilizes. Competition gives way to coexistence. Growth slows uniformly across species. Biomass accumulation reaches equilibrium. Input balances output. Expansion halts naturally without collapse. The forest's chemical environment becomes buffered. pH levels fluctuate minimally. Nutrient availability remains consistent. Even disturbance-driven renewal becomes rare. Large-scale resets diminish. The system favors continuity over reorganization. Silence becomes a defining feature. Not absolute silence, but the absence of abrupt change. Ancient forests do not mark time through events. They mark it through persistence. At this scale, survival is not an achievement. It is a condition. The forest does not adapt quickly, but it adapts thoroughly. It remains not because it resists disruption, but because disruption must last long enough to matter. Time becomes the primary shaping force. The forest continues, extended across generations, landscapes, and eras. That is, ancient forests extend through ages beyond written history. Their presence becomes less about accumulation and more about maintenance. What exists is sustained not by growth, but by careful balance between emergence and return. Energy flows slow to a near constant rate. Seasonal variation continues, but within boundaries long established. The forest rarely exceeds its own capacity. Matter cycles repeatedly through familiar paths. Leaves fall, decompose, and rise again as structure. Wood decays, feeds soil, and supports new growth. Nothing is hurried. Nothing is withheld. Spatial memory persists. Clearings formed centuries earlier remain subtly different from surrounding areas. Soil depth, moisture retention, and species composition still reflect those earlier conditions. Roots follow historical pathways. Underground networks mirror patterns formed long ago, reinforced through repetition rather than intention. The forest becomes increasingly tolerant of uncertainty. Variability is expected. Stability arises not from control, but from accommodation. Interactions simplify. Complex systems resolve into reliable relationships. Predictability increases without rigidity. The forest's interior feels temporally distant from the present. External time moves quickly by comparison. What occurs rapidly elsewhere arrives here softened and delayed. Evolutionary pressure remains but directionless. Traits persist that align with continuity rather than advantage. Even decay slows. Decomposition occurs at rates matched to accumulation. Excess rarely appears. The forest neither expands nor contracts significantly. It occupies its place fully without striving beyond it. In this state, the forest is less an ecosystem than a condition, a long-standing arrangement of matter and energy sustained through repetition. Nothing within it anticipates an ending. The forest remains because remaining is its natural state. At the furthest limits of continuity, ancient forests begin to exist as reference points in time. They no longer reflect change directly, instead they reveal change by how little they respond to it. What alters rapidly elsewhere becomes almost unnoticeable here. The forest's internal systems reach a form of quiet equilibrium. Not a final state, but a condition that renews itself through repetition. Processes loop gently, rarely diverging from familiar paths. Matter remains in circulation longer. Elements spend extended periods locked within wood, soil, and deep organic layers. Exchange with the outside slows. The forest's boundaries become conceptual rather than physical. Its influence extends beyond where trees stand, into air movement, moisture patterns, and regional stability. Within the forest, distinctions blur. Living and non-living matter intertwine. Decay and growth overlap continuously. The idea of separation loses clarity. Species identity becomes secondary to function. Roles persist even as participants change. Continuity resides in relationship, not form. The forest's pace aligns almost perfectly with planetary rhythms. Seasonal cycles, orbital patterns, and long-term climate shifts integrate into its timing. Nothing here requires acceleration. Nothing demands resolution. The forest exists in sustained balance with uncertainty, neither resisting nor yielding completely. Time passes through it rather than over it. And so, the forest continues, quiet, extended, and unchanged in the only way that matters. At extreme scales of time, ancient forests no longer appear as environments reacting to conditions. Instead, they behave as stabilizing fields within which conditions unfold. Change does not enter suddenly. It diffuses. The forest's interior becomes temporally insulated. Events occurring beyond its boundaries arrive diminished, stretched across years or decades. A drought felt sharply elsewhere registers here as a gradual adjustment. A warming trend expresses itself through subtle shifts in species distribution rather than visible stress. Matter within the forest circulates through extended loops. A single atom of carbon may pass through leaf, soil, root, trunk, and fungal network over centuries without leaving the system. Exchange with the external world slows further as retention increases. Structural redundancy deepens. Multiple pathways exist for energy, water, and nutrients. When one route weakens, others compensate seamlessly. This overlap removes dependence on any single component. Growth becomes increasingly conservative. Trees invest less in expansion and more in maintenance. Cell walls thicken. Internal transport systems stabilize. Longevity takes precedence over output. Soil horizons mature further. Boundaries between layers blur as biological activity integrates them. Chemical gradients flatten. Extremes dissolve into averages. Microorganisms dominate by number and influence. Their metabolism sets the tempo of decomposition and renewal. They operate continuously yet quietly, shaping the system without visible motion. Fungal networks reach remarkable complexity. Connections extend across vast distances underground. Resource movement becomes efficient not through speed, but through reliability. Losses are minimal. Water retention improves as organic matter accumulates. Moisture persists through dry seasons. Flow slows during wet ones. The forest moderates hydrological extremes without intervention. The forest soundscape continues to simplify. Abrupt sounds are absorbed. What remains are long, low-frequency textures, wind filtered through leaves, distant movements softened by distance and density. Light becomes a scarce but predictable resource. Photosynthetic strategies adapt accordingly. Leaves orient themselves precisely. Energy capture is optimized through familiarity rather than competition. Species behavior stabilizes. Migration routes, feeding patterns, and reproduction cycles repeat with little variation. Predictability replaces experimentation. Evolutionary change continues, but at reduced amplitude. Selection favors traits compatible with long-term stability. Radical adaptation becomes less frequent. Disturbance, when it occurs, unfolds slowly. Even large-scale change requires persistence to register. Single events rarely leave lasting marks. The forest becomes increasingly self-referential. Internal processes depend more on internal feedback than external input. Autonomy increases. Time within the forest feels distributed rather than linear. Past, present, and future overlap through structure. What exists now carries traces of what existed long ago and constraints on what may exist later. The forest does not record history intentionally, yet its form is an archive. Patterns persist where memory might otherwise fade. At this scale, the forest cannot be fully understood as a collection of organisms. It functions more accurately as a continuous process, an ongoing negotiation between matter, energy, and duration. There is no central coordination, no guiding principle. Order emerges from repetition alone. Nothing accelerates. Nothing concludes. The forest remains extended, stable, and quietly responsive, not to moments but to eras. As ancient forests persist across spans of time that exceed cultural memory, their presence becomes increasingly subtle yet more influential. They do not dominate landscapes through height or density alone, but through continuity. What they offer is duration. Within these forests, cause and effect stretch across generations. Actions no longer produce immediate outcomes. Instead, influence accumulates slowly, shaping conditions long after the initiating event has passed. A seed germinating today may be responding to soil chemistry altered centuries earlier. A mature tree may owe its structure to light patterns established by long-vanished neighbors. Time layers influence upon influence. The forest's internal pace regulates biological clocks. Organisms synchronize their life cycles not to abstract measures of time, but to environmental consistency. This synchronization reduces stress and increases reliability. Chemical exchanges occur at rates aligned with this pace. Nutrient release from decomposing matter matches uptake by roots. Surpluses are rare. Deficits are buffered. The forest's resilience becomes passive rather than active. It does not counter disruption aggressively. It absorbs it gradually, redistributing impact across space and time. Spatial patterns remain stable. Pathways carved by animals centuries ago persist subtly in soil compaction and vegetation structure. Movement continues along established routes. Tree architecture reflects accumulated experience. Branch orientation, trunk thickness, and root spread embody responses to repeated environmental pressures. Growth is shaped by history more than by present conditions. The forest's edge evolves slowly. Boundaries migrate almost imperceptibly. Expansion and retreat occur through generational shifts rather than invasion. Atmospheric interaction deepens. Moisture cycling becomes more efficient. Air passing through the forest changes character, emerging cooler, more humid, and chemically altered. These atmospheric effects extend outward, influencing surrounding ecosystems. The forest's reach exceeds its physical form. Within the forest, silence grows denser. Activity remains constant but predictable. Surprise diminishes. The system becomes increasingly tolerant of variability. Fluctuations that would destabilize younger ecosystems register only faintly here. Long-lived organisms dominate. Their extended presence reduces turnover. Stability reinforces itself. Evolution proceeds through refinement rather than innovation. Traits persist that align with continuity and balance. Even decline occurs slowly. Aging trees weaken over decades. Collapse is anticipated structurally long before it occurs. The forest exists as a temporal anchor. It holds place within shifting environments, offering consistency through change. This is not permanence, but persistence aligned with time itself. The forest continues not by resisting motion, but by moving slowly enough to endure it. As ancient forests approach the far edges of continuity, their internal processes begin to resemble slow currents rather than discrete events. Motion exists, but it is diffused across long intervals, making beginnings and endings difficult to identify. Energy transfer becomes exceptionally smooth. Peaks flatten. Valleys fill. The forest's internal dynamics operate within a narrow range of variation that persists across generations. Water movement slows further. Subsurface reservoirs expand. Moisture lingers in soil and organic layers, released only gradually. Droughts lose definition. Wet periods blend softly into dry ones. Soil structure becomes highly integrated. Physical boundaries between mineral, organic, and biological layers blur. Life and substrate merge functionally. Microbial metabolism sets the tempo for nearly all transformations. Chemical reactions proceed at rates determined by stable temperature and moisture, rarely deviating. Fungal dominance increases. Networks thicken and interconnect, ensuring reliable distribution of resources across space. Failures become localized rather than systemic. Vegetation growth aligns with available energy rather than demand. Trees expand only where conditions allow, maintaining proportional spacing. The forest's interior resists fragmentation. Even when external pressures increase, internal cohesion remains. Acoustic patterns stabilize further. Sound becomes continuous texture rather than event. The environment absorbs interruption. Light distribution settles into long-term patterns. Gaps appear predictably and close gradually. Photosynthetic strategies reflect familiarity rather than competition. Species turnover slows. Replacement occurs gently. No abrupt succession dominates. The forest's relationship with time becomes increasingly symmetrical. Past influence persists. Future constraint is anticipated structurally. At this scale, adaptation is not reaction. It is alignment. The forest remains because it exists at the same pace as the forces that shape it. At the deepest temporal scales, ancient forests become less distinguishable as biological systems and more recognizable as long-form processes. What defines them is no longer composition, but persistence through alignment. Their internal dynamics no longer seek balance, they exist within it. Variation occurs, but it unfolds so slowly that it never disrupts continuity. Change becomes a background condition rather than an event. Material within the forest reaches extended residence times. Elements circulate internally for centuries before exchanging with the outside environment. Loss is minimized not through conservation but through duration. Tree lifespans overlap across generations. Young growth develops under the influence of mature structures that predate it by centuries. The presence of age stabilizes the system. Soil becomes increasingly self-regulating. Moisture, temperature, and nutrient availability fluctuate within narrow ranges. Extremes rarely penetrate deeply. Microbial ecosystems mature into stable configurations. Their metabolic output aligns precisely with decomposition needs. Excess activity becomes unnecessary. The forest's influence on climate becomes diffuse but persistent. Moisture recycling, carbon storage, and thermal moderation operate continuously without visible markers. Wind patterns adjust over time. Airflow above and around the forest changes character, becoming less turbulent, more predictable. Boundaries between forest and non-forest soften further. Transitions extend across distance rather than forming sharp edges. Influence extends beyond visibility. Within the forest, biological novelty decreases. Systems favor reliability over experimentation. What persists is what fits the established rhythm. Evolutionary pressure shifts toward compatibility. Traits that disrupt balance fade. Traits that reinforce continuity remain. Even disturbances integrate gradually. When disruption persists long enough, the forest transforms rather than collapses. Adjustment replaces response. At this point, the forest functions as a stabilizing presence within broader ecological and geological systems. It anchors variability rather than eliminating it. Time within the forest feels suspended, not halted but evenly distributed. Past processes continue to operate alongside present ones. The forest does not aim toward an outcome. It does not progress toward completion. Its form is sustained by repetition rather than direction. Nothing here seeks resolution. The forest exists because it continues. As ancient forests persist beyond familiar measures of time, they begin to operate almost independently of external reference. Calendars lose relevance. Markers dissolve. What remains is duration expressed through form. The forest no longer responds to short cycles in noticeable ways. Years blend into one another. Decades compress into subtle adjustments. Centuries pass as minor reconfigurations of structure rather than dramatic change. Within this continuity, stability does not imply rigidity. Flexibility exists, but it unfolds slowly. Branches bend over years rather than moments. Roots redirect growth incrementally. Adjustment is constant but unhurried. Nutrient reservoirs deepen. Organic matter accumulates in forms that resist rapid breakdown. Availability remains steady, not because supply is constant, but because release is controlled by time itself. The forest floor becomes increasingly buffered. Temperature shifts weaken with depth. Moisture persists across seasons. Life below the surface experiences a world with fewer extremes. Microbial communities operate with minimal fluctuation. Their populations rise and fall gently, guided by availability rather than competition. Cooperation dominates by default. Fungal structures become persistent features of the system. Their networks mirror the forest's longevity, extending across generations of plant life. They endure by adapting slowly, not by expanding rapidly. Trees interact with gravity continuously. Load-bearing structures reinforce over time. Wood density increases. Growth patterns reflect accumulated experience with stress and recovery. Canopy movement synchronizes with prevailing winds. Over time, trees adjust branch orientation to minimize strain. Motion becomes predictable, reducing structural fatigue. The forest's acoustic environment stabilizes further. Sounds arrive softened, filtered, and delayed. Silence becomes textured rather than empty. Light behaves predictably. Seasonal angles repeat. Photosynthetic activity aligns with established expectations. Energy capture remains sufficient without excess. Species interactions become habitual. Relationships repeat across generations. Novelty decreases but reliability increases. Predation, herbivory, and reproduction settle into consistent ratios. Population sizes fluctuate within narrow bounds. Overshoot becomes unlikely. The forest becomes increasingly difficult to classify by snapshot observation. Its defining features reveal themselves only through extended presence. Short visits capture little. Time must pass within the forest for the forest to be understood. At this scale, even adaptation loses urgency. Survival does not depend on speed but on continuity. What persists is what fits seamlessly into long rhythms. The forest's intelligence, if it can be called that, is distributed across structure, timing, and restraint. It does not solve problems. It avoids creating them. Nothing here accelerates. Nothing concludes. The forest remains extended across time, not resisting change, not pursuing growth, but existing in steady alignment with the slow movement of the world itself. As ancient forests continue through stretches of time that erase distinction between past and present, their internal order becomes increasingly implicit. Rules are no longer visible. They are embedded. Processes no longer announce themselves through change. They reveal themselves through consistency. What happens today closely resembles what happened long ago, not because nothing has changed but because change has been absorbed into form. The forest's internal feedback loops tighten gently. Signals travel short distances, slowly, rarely triggering large responses. Adjustment becomes local, precise, and sufficient. Matter remains in circulation for extended durations. Leaves that fall may take decades to fully integrate. Wood may persist for centuries before returning to soil. Nothing is rushed back into use. Roots occupy space densely yet calmly. They do not compete aggressively. They negotiate boundaries gradually, yielding where resistance increases. Soil compression increases subtly over time. Pore spaces remain open, allowing gas exchange and water movement without collapse. Structure is preserved through balance. Microbial activity becomes finely tuned to available substrate. Excess growth diminishes. Metabolism aligns with long-term availability rather than short-term abundance. The forest's chemical environment stabilizes further. Variations in acidity, moisture, and nutrient concentration narrow. Extremes dissolve into averages. Tree canopies interlock into continuous surfaces. Individual forms blur into collective structure. Light penetration becomes predictable, reinforcing established growth patterns. Wind energy dissipates smoothly across layers. Turbulence diminishes. Motion becomes rhythmic rather than chaotic. The forest's interior experiences fewer surprises. Most variation arrives gradually enough to be integrated without disruption. Species coexistence deepens. Competitive exclusion weakens. Niche overlap increases. Redundancy strengthens resilience. Reproductive strategies favor reliability. Fewer offspring survive, but survival rates stabilize. Population swings soften. Evolutionary change continues quietly. Genetic diversity persists within bounds that support continuity. Extremes fade without announcement. Disturbance becomes increasingly rare in effect. Even when external pressures intensify, internal structure absorbs impact through delay and diffusion. The forest's presence extends conceptually beyond itself. It becomes a reference against which change elsewhere is measured. What shifts rapidly outside feels exaggerated by contrast. Within the forest, time does not feel segmented. There are no sharp transitions, only gradual rebalancing. Moments lose definition. The forest does not remember events. It remembers conditions. What persists is not history but alignment with duration. At this scale, the forest no longer appears to function. It simply exists in a state of continuous adjustment so subtle it resembles stillness. Nothing seeks completion. Nothing signals an ending. The forest remains, stretched across time, quietly compatible with everything that moves slowly enough to stay. As ancient forests extend further into uninterrupted time, their most defining characteristic becomes invisibility of effort. Nothing within them appears to be working, yet everything functions. This absence of strain is not accidental. It is the result of alignment refined over vast duration. Processes no longer compensate for imbalance because imbalance rarely forms. Supply and demand converge naturally. Energy arrives at the rate it can be used. Matter returns at the rate it can be absorbed. The forest's interior becomes increasingly predictable without becoming static. Patterns repeat, but each repetition carries minor variation. These variations do not accumulate into disruption. They dissolve back into the whole. Roots continue to adjust position millimeter by millimeter over years. They avoid pressure points, seek stable moisture, and reinforce structural integrity underground. Movement exists, but it is too slow to register as motion. Tree crowns subtly reshape themselves across decades. Branches thicken where stress repeats. Others thin and withdraw. Architecture evolves through memory encoded in structure. The forest floor maintains its soft complexity. Layers remain permeable. Water infiltrates evenly. Oxygen reaches deep enough to sustain slow life. Anaerobic zones form only where necessary, preserving carbon quietly. Microbial populations operate with remarkable restraint. Growth is limited by long-term availability rather than immediate opportunity. Waste is minimal. Efficiency arises from patience. Fungal networks continue to dominate distribution. Their growth is exploratory but cautious. New connections form gradually. Old ones persist until no longer needed. Light becomes a managed resource without management. Leaves orient precisely. Canopy density adjusts slowly. Photosynthetic demand never exceeds supply. Species interactions grow increasingly familiar. Encounters repeat across generations. Behavioral patterns stabilize. Energy expenditure decreases. Predators maintain presence without excess. Prey populations remain within sustainable limits. Movement patterns minimize risk without eliminating it. Sound remains subdued. Even storms arrive softened. The forest absorbs shock through mass, density, and depth. External change presses against the system continuously, but only long-term pressure reshapes it. Short-lived extremes pass without trace. The forest's relationship with time becomes nonlinear. Past conditions remain active. Future conditions are anticipated structurally rather than consciously. What survives here is not the fastest responder, but the most compatible presence. Survival is not an event. It is a state. At this depth of continuity, the forest ceases to feel alive in the immediate sense. It feels ongoing. Alive not through motion but through persistence. The system no longer demonstrates resilience. It embodies it. Nothing concludes. Nothing escalates. The forest remains suspended in duration, adjusting quietly, endlessly, without requiring attention or recognition. As ancient forests persist without interruption, their presence becomes increasingly subtle in its expression, yet deeper in its effect. They no longer announce themselves through density or scale. Instead, they reveal themselves through the way surrounding systems slow down in their proximity. Time within the forest stretches. Processes that elsewhere feel urgent become gradual here. The forest does not delay them intentionally, it simply offers enough structure that urgency loses relevance. Growth continues, but it is evenly distributed. No single area expands rapidly. No single species dominates. Balance emerges through shared limitation. The forest's internal exchanges require little correction. Nutrients circulate through established paths. Energy flows without congestion. Waste is absorbed before it accumulates. Roots form layered systems beneath the surface. Some remain shallow, interacting with recent organic matter. Others descend deeply, anchoring structure and drawing from stable reserves. Together they create continuity across depth. Soil texture becomes increasingly refined. Particle sizes distribute evenly. Porosity remains consistent. Water movement slows but never stops. Microbial life adapts fully to these conditions. Metabolism aligns with long-term averages. Sudden blooms become rare. Activity remains constant but restrained. Fungal systems continue to integrate space. Their networks extend, retract, and stabilize over decades. They serve as memory not of events, but of conditions that persist. Trees adjust posture slowly. Leaning trunks correct themselves over years. Stress fractures are reinforced internally. Failure is anticipated and prevented where possible. The canopy forms a continuous, living surface. Gaps appear rarely and close gradually. Light reaches the forest floor in familiar patterns that repeat season after season. Animal movement becomes habitual. Routes persist. Timing stabilizes. Energy expenditure is minimized through familiarity with terrain. Predation maintains equilibrium without excess. Fear exists, but it is measured. No species overwhelms another for long. Sound becomes increasingly diffuse. Even distinct calls blend into the broader acoustic field. Silence becomes layered rather than empty. Climate variability continues beyond the forest, but within it, expression is softened. Heat disperses. Cold penetrates shallowly. Moisture persists. The forest's influence extends outward invisibly. Air that passes through carries altered temperature and humidity. Precipitation patterns adjust subtly over time. Boundaries continue to soften. Transition zones widen. The forest does not end abruptly. It fades gradually into other systems. At this stage, the forest is less an ecosystem than a temporal structure, a way for matter to remain arranged long enough to be stable. It does not seek renewal. Renewal occurs automatically through turnover aligned with continuity. There is no urgency to replace what fades. Replacement arrives eventually at a pace that preserves balance. Nothing within the forest measures progress. There is no sense of advancement or decline. Only continuation. The forest remains present not because it resists change, but because it accommodates it slowly enough to remain intact. As ancient forests endure beyond the span of collective memory, their influence becomes increasingly diffuse, spreading not through expansion but through steadiness. They do not impose structure upon their surroundings, they invite it. Within these forests, time ceases to feel directional. There is movement but no clear sense of forward progression. What changes does so gradually enough that beginnings dissolve into continuations. The forest's internal balance becomes self-sustaining. Adjustments occur continuously, yet never dramatically. Each small correction prevents the need for larger ones. Energy remains evenly distributed. Surges dissipate before they concentrate. Deficits are filled through slow release from accumulated reserves. Roots continue their quiet exploration. They expand where space allows, withdraw where resistance builds, and reinforce where stability is needed. Their motion is patient, precise, and persistent. Soil life operates as a collective regulator. Microorganisms respond to subtle changes in moisture and chemistry, adjusting activity levels without overshoot. Their presence ensures continuity without excess. Fungal systems maintain connectivity across the forest. Their networks serve as conduits for matter and information, functioning without hierarchy or command. Distribution follows need, not priority. Tree growth reflects accumulated adaptation. Height increases slow. Girth expands incrementally. Strength becomes more important than reach. The canopy remains dense yet permeable. Light filters through in predictable patterns. Photosynthesis proceeds steadily, aligned with long-term availability rather than momentary abundance. Animal populations stabilize further. Reproductive rates align with carrying capacity. Migration, where it occurs, follows established rhythms. Predators and prey maintain long-standing relationships. Balance is not enforced through scarcity, but through mutual limitation. Sound within the forest continues to soften. Even pronounced disturbances arrive muted. The environment absorbs vibration through mass and texture. Climate influences persist outside, but within the forest their effects are moderated. Temperature gradients flatten. Moisture lingers. Extremes rarely penetrate deeply. The forest's edge continues to blur. Transition zones expand. The distinction between forest and non-forest becomes a gradient rather than a boundary. At this depth of continuity, the forest functions as a stabilizing medium. It holds patterns in place long enough for them to endure. Nothing here accelerates toward an outcome. There is no culmination. Processes repeat because repetition sustains structure. The forest does not accumulate history as narrative. It accumulates it as form. Shapes, spacing, density, and depth carry the imprint of time. This persistence is not resistance. It is compatibility with slowness. The forest remains not as a monument, but as an ongoing arrangement of matter that has learned how to last. Evolutionary change continues quietly. Genetic diversity persists within bounds that support continuity. Extremes fade without announcement. Disturbance becomes increasingly rare in effect. Even when external pressures intensify, internal structure absorbs impact through delay and diffusion. The forest's presence extends conceptually beyond itself. It becomes a reference against which change elsewhere is measured. What shifts rapidly outside feels exaggerated by contrast. Within the forest, time does not feel segmented. There are no sharp transitions, only gradual rebalancing. Moments lose definition. The forest does not remember events. It remembers conditions. What persists is not history but alignment with duration. At this scale, the forest no longer appears to function. It simply exists in a state of continuous adjustment so subtle it resembles stillness. Nothing seeks completion. Nothing signals an ending. The forest remains, stretched across time, quietly compatible with everything that moves slowly enough to stay. As ancient forests extend further into uninterrupted time, their most defining characteristic becomes invisibility of effort. Nothing within them appears to be working, yet everything functions. This absence of strain is not accidental. It is the result of alignment refined over vast duration. Processes no longer compensate for imbalance because imbalance rarely forms. Supply and demand converge naturally. Energy arrives at the rate it can be used. Matter returns at the rate it can be absorbed. The forest's interior becomes increasingly predictable without becoming static. Patterns repeat, but each repetition carries minor variation. These variations do not accumulate into disruption. They dissolve back into the whole. Roots continue to adjust position millimeter by millimeter over years. They avoid pressure points, seek stable moisture, and reinforce structural integrity underground. Movement exists, but it is too slow to register as motion. Tree crowns subtly reshape themselves across decades. Branches thicken where stress repeats. Others thin and withdraw. Architecture evolves through memory encoded in structure. The forest floor maintains its soft complexity. Layers remain permeable. Water infiltrates evenly. Oxygen reaches deep enough to sustain slow life. Anaerobic zones form only where necessary, preserving carbon quietly. Microbial populations operate with remarkable restraint. Growth is limited by long-term availability rather than immediate opportunity. Waste is minimal. Efficiency arises from patience. Fungal networks continue to dominate distribution. Their growth is exploratory but cautious. New connections form gradually. Old ones persist until no longer needed. Light becomes a managed resource without management. Leaves orient precisely. Canopy density adjusts slowly. Photosynthetic demand never exceeds supply. Species interactions grow increasingly familiar. Encounters repeat across generations. Behavioral patterns stabilize. Energy expenditure decreases. Predators maintain presence without excess. Prey populations remain within sustainable limits. Movement patterns minimize risk without eliminating it. Sound remains subdued. Even storms arrive softened. The forest absorbs shock through mass, density, and depth. External change presses against the system continuously, but only long-term pressure reshapes it. Short-lived extremes pass without trace. The forest's relationship with time becomes nonlinear. Past conditions remain active. Future conditions are anticipated structurally rather than consciously. What survives here is not the fastest responder, but the most compatible presence. Survival is not an event. It is a state. At this depth of continuity, the forest ceases to feel alive in the immediate sense. It feels ongoing. Alive not through motion but through persistence. The system no longer demonstrates resilience. It embodies it. Nothing concludes. Nothing escalates. The forest remains suspended in duration, adjusting quietly, endlessly, without requiring attention or recognition. As the forest persists across longer spans of time, its most defining characteristic becomes its refusal to emphasize any single moment. Events occur but none demand attention. Each one is absorbed into the broader continuity without disturbance. The forest does not remember in images or sequences. It remembers through arrangement. Spacing between trees, thickness of soil layers, and the curvature of roots all reflect accumulated time without recounting it. Decay proceeds quietly. Fallen material settles into the forest floor, breaking down at a pace aligned with surrounding conditions. Nothing is rushed toward disappearance. Nothing lingers unnecessarily. Nutrients re-enter circulation gradually. Redistribution occurs through shared pathways rather than direct transfer. Balance is maintained through patience. Moisture continues its slow cycle. Evaporation, condensation, and absorption remain evenly paced. Extremes are softened through repetition. The forest floor develops a layered softness. Each layer compresses gently under weight, then returns to form. Resilience becomes embedded. Microbial systems remain responsive but restrained. They expand when needed, retreat when sufficient. Their activity smooths irregularities before they become pronounced. Fungal networks remain uninterrupted. They adapt routing continuously, bypassing obstacles and reinforcing efficient paths. Their structure mirrors the forest's overall tendency toward continuity. Trees remain upright not through rigidity, but through distributed strength. Stress disperses across fibers, branches, and roots. Failure is rare and gradual. The canopy's texture evolves subtly. Leaves appear and disappear in familiar patterns. Coverage remains consistent, allowing light to filter evenly. Animals maintain established routines. Movement occurs along remembered routes. Exploration becomes unnecessary where stability is sufficient. Predator presence remains constant. Prey populations adjust through minor shifts rather than collapse. Balance persists through mutual awareness. Sound within the forest remains diffuse. Individual sources lose definition as they blend into the ambient field. The environment absorbs intensity. Temperature remains moderated. Heat disperses upward through layered foliage. Cold settles but does not penetrate deeply. The forest's influence continues beyond its visible edge. Air leaving the forest carries altered humidity and temperature. Water flowing outward is filtered and stabilized. Boundaries continue to dissolve. The forest transitions into adjacent systems gradually, influencing them without overt change. At this depth of persistence, the forest functions less as a location and more as a condition. It defines how matter behaves when allowed to remain undisturbed. There is no signal to begin. No marker of completion. The forest exists as a continuous present, extended across time without emphasis or interruption. Nothing waits. Nothing hurries. The forest remains not by holding still, but by moving slowly enough to stay whole. As the forest continues to exist without interruption, its presence becomes less something that can be observed and more something that can be sensed indirectly. It alters behavior without instruction. It slows processes without resistance. Within the forest, cause and effect separate by long intervals. Actions do not lead to immediate outcomes. Instead, influence disperses gradually, returning in subtle ways over extended periods. This separation removes urgency. Nothing expects a response. Nothing anticipates a result. Systems operate without feedback that demands correction. The forest floor continues to accumulate layers. Organic matter settles gently, compressing under its own weight. Decomposition proceeds evenly, guided by moisture, temperature, and microbial balance. No layer is fully distinct. Boundaries blur. Materials transition smoothly from structure to nutrient, from form to function. Roots continue their quiet negotiation with soil. They adjust direction in response to density rather than obstruction. Growth follows least resistance without force. Below the surface, networks overlap without interference. Each occupies space long enough to be useful, then yields without conflict. Tree trunks remain stable through distributed flexibility. Fibers respond to wind not by resisting, but by yielding slightly, returning afterward to alignment. Branches grow where light has consistently been available, not where it appears suddenly. This ensures symmetry without design. Leaves emerge, perform their function, and withdraw. Their cycle repeats without variation that would draw attention. The canopy remains a filter rather than a barrier. Light enters softened, diffused, and predictable. Photosynthesis proceeds quietly. Animals move with minimal disruption. Their presence alters little. Paths remain visible only through repeated use, never through damage. Interactions occur without escalation. Competition resolves through spacing and timing rather than dominance. Sound becomes texture. Individual sources dissolve into the ambient field. Silence is not absence but continuity. Temperature remains moderated through mass and layering. The forest holds warmth and releases it slowly. Cold enters but dissipates. Moisture persists. Evaporation slows. Condensation increases. Water cycles through surfaces repeatedly before leaving. The forest's influence extends outward in subtle gradients. Surrounding air shifts. Soil moisture stabilizes nearby. Waterways run clearer downstream. Edges soften further. The forest does not end. It transitions. At this level of continuity, the forest no longer reacts to change. It absorbs it. Disturbance becomes input rather than interruption. Nothing within the forest signals importance. Nothing marks priority. Everything continues at a pace determined by accumulated balance. There is no narrative here. No progression. No climax. Only presence extended across time. The forest remains not because it is preserved, but because it has learned how not to rush. As time stretches further within the forest, even the idea of duration begins to lose clarity. There are no reference points strong enough to divide one period from another. What exists now feels indistinguishable from what existed before. The forest does not register passing years. It registers only conditions. When those conditions remain within familiar ranges, continuity persists without comment. Processes overlap gently. Growth, decay, absorption, and release occur simultaneously, layered so evenly that none stand apart. Each supports the others simply by continuing. The ground remains resilient. Pressure disperses outward rather than downward. Movement leaves little trace. Imprints soften quickly and fade. Organic matter continues its quiet transformation. Structure becomes texture. Texture becomes nutrient. Nutrient becomes structure again without interruption. Chemical balances remain stable through constant exchange. Excess is diluted. Shortage is buffered. Extremes rarely form. Roots maintain their distributed architecture. They avoid concentration, spreading influence evenly through soil. This prevents strain and preserves flexibility. Below, fungal networks continue to coordinate exchange. They redistribute without accumulation, ensuring that no region experiences sharp imbalance. Tree forms remain consistent. Height and width stabilize. Internal density increases gradually, reinforcing structure without visible change. Wind passes through the canopy with minimal resistance. Leaves shift collectively, reducing stress on individual branches. Motion becomes shared. Light enters the forest in soft gradients. Brightness is moderated before reaching the ground. Shadows remain diffuse and stable. Photosynthetic activity aligns with long-term availability rather than momentary abundance. Energy intake remains sufficient, never excessive. Animals move quietly. Their presence rarely alters the environment. Paths are reinforced gently, never carved deeply. Interactions occur through proximity rather than conflict. Space and timing resolve competition naturally. The forest's acoustic field remains even. Sounds arrive softened, travel briefly, and dissolve. Nothing lingers sharply. Thermal regulation continues uninterrupted. Heat is absorbed, stored, and released slowly. Cold is filtered through layers before settling. Moisture remains present across surfaces. Evaporation slows. Condensation increases. Water remains within the system longer than it leaves. Beyond the forest, subtle changes accumulate. Air patterns shift. Water clarity improves. Surrounding systems stabilize slightly through proximity. Evolutionary change continues quietly. Genetic diversity persists within bounds that support continuity. Extremes fade without announcement. Disturbance becomes increasingly rare in effect. Even when external pressures intensify, internal structure absorbs impact through delay and diffusion. The forest's presence extends conceptually beyond itself. It becomes a reference against which change elsewhere is measured. What shifts rapidly outside feels exaggerated by contrast. Within the forest, time does not feel segmented. There are no sharp transitions, only gradual rebalancing. Moments lose definition. The forest does not remember events. It remembers conditions. What persists is not history but alignment with duration. At this scale, the forest no longer appears to function. It simply exists in a state of continuous adjustment so subtle it resembles stillness. Nothing seeks completion. Nothing signals an ending. The forest remains, stretched across time, quietly compatible with everything that moves slowly enough to stay. As ancient forests extend further into uninterrupted time, their most defining characteristic becomes invisibility of effort. Nothing within them appears to be working, yet everything functions. This absence of strain is not accidental. It is the result of alignment refined over vast duration. Processes no longer compensate for imbalance because imbalance rarely forms. Supply and demand converge naturally. Energy arrives at the rate it can be used. Matter returns at the rate it can be absorbed. The forest's interior becomes increasingly predictable without becoming static. Patterns repeat, but each repetition carries minor variation. These variations do not accumulate into disruption. They dissolve back into the whole. Roots continue to adjust position millimeter by millimeter over years. They avoid pressure points, seek stable moisture, and reinforce structural integrity underground. Movement exists, but it is too slow to register as motion. Tree crowns subtly reshape themselves across decades. Branches thicken where stress repeats. Others thin and withdraw. Architecture evolves through memory encoded in structure. The forest floor maintains its soft complexity. Layers remain permeable. Water infiltrates evenly. Oxygen reaches deep enough to sustain slow life. Anaerobic zones form only where necessary, preserving carbon quietly. Microbial populations operate with remarkable restraint. Growth is limited by long-term availability rather than immediate opportunity. Waste is minimal. Efficiency arises from patience. Fungal networks continue to dominate distribution. Their growth is exploratory but cautious. New connections form gradually. Old ones persist until no longer needed. Light becomes a managed resource without management. Leaves orient precisely. Canopy density adjusts slowly. Photosynthetic demand never exceeds supply. Species interactions grow increasingly familiar. Encounters repeat across generations. Behavioral patterns stabilize. Energy expenditure decreases. Predators maintain presence without excess. Prey populations remain within sustainable limits. Movement patterns minimize risk without eliminating it. Sound remains subdued. Even storms arrive softened. The forest absorbs shock through mass, density, and depth. External change presses against the system continuously, but only long-term pressure reshapes it. Short-lived extremes pass without trace. The forest's relationship with time becomes nonlinear. Past conditions remain active. Future conditions are anticipated structurally rather than consciously. What survives here is not the fastest responder, but the most compatible presence. Survival is not an event. It is a state. At this depth of continuity, the forest ceases to feel alive in the immediate sense. It feels ongoing. Alive not through motion but through persistence. The system no longer demonstrates resilience. It embodies it. Nothing concludes. Nothing escalates. The forest remains suspended in duration, adjusting quietly, endlessly, without requiring attention or recognition. As the forest persists across longer spans of time, its most defining characteristic becomes its refusal to emphasize any single moment. Events occur but none demand attention. Each one is absorbed into the broader continuity without disturbance. The forest does not remember in images or sequences. It remembers through arrangement. Spacing between trees, thickness of soil layers, and the curvature of roots all reflect accumulated time without recounting it. Decay proceeds quietly. Fallen material settles into the forest floor, breaking down at a pace aligned with surrounding conditions. Nothing is rushed toward disappearance. Nothing lingers unnecessarily. Nutrients re-enter circulation gradually. Redistribution occurs through shared pathways rather than direct transfer. Balance is maintained through patience. Moisture continues its slow cycle. Evaporation, condensation, and absorption remain evenly paced. Extremes are softened through repetition. The forest floor develops a layered softness. Each layer compresses gently under weight, then returns to form. Resilience becomes embedded. Microbial systems remain responsive but restrained. They expand when needed, retreat when sufficient. Their activity smooths irregularities before they become pronounced. Fungal networks remain uninterrupted. They adapt routing continuously, bypassing obstacles and reinforcing efficient paths. Their structure mirrors the forest's overall tendency toward continuity. Trees remain upright not through rigidity, but through distributed strength. Stress disperses across fibers, branches, and roots. Failure is rare and gradual. The canopy's texture evolves subtly. Leaves appear and disappear in familiar patterns. Coverage remains consistent, allowing light to filter evenly. Animals maintain established routines. Movement occurs along remembered routes. Exploration becomes unnecessary where stability is sufficient. Predator presence remains constant. Prey populations adjust through minor shifts rather than collapse. Balance persists through mutual awareness. Sound within the forest remains diffuse. Individual sources lose definition as they blend into the ambient field. The environment absorbs intensity. Temperature remains moderated. Heat disperses upward through layered foliage. Cold settles but does not penetrate deeply. Edges continue to fade. The forest transitions into other landscapes through gradients rather than lines. At this depth of continuity, the forest functions as a stabilizing influence rather than an active system. It shapes behavior simply by existing. Nothing here seeks attention. Nothing demands notice. The forest continues without emphasis, without urgency, without pause. It remains not as an event, but as an ongoing condition. Steady, balanced, and unhurried. As continuity deepens within the forest, even distinction itself begins to soften. The difference between background and foreground dissolves. Everything becomes part of the same, uninterrupted field. There is no central point of activity. No area demands focus. Attention disperses naturally, settling nowhere in particular. The forest holds complexity without tension. Countless interactions occur, yet none require management. Order emerges from repetition rather than control. Matter circulates slowly. Nothing remains fixed, yet nothing moves quickly enough to disrupt form. Stability arises through gradual exchange. The forest floor remains layered and forgiving. Pressure distributes evenly. Weight leaves no lasting imprint. Surfaces recover without effort. Decomposition continues as a quiet undercurrent. Material breaks down not into absence but into readiness. Everything becomes available again in time. Chemical signals remain subtle. Concentrations never spike. Communication occurs through low gradients, sufficient to guide without urgency. Roots continue their silent coordination. They share space without crowding, expanding only where balance allows. Below, fungal systems persist as pathways rather than structures. Their presence is felt through effect, not form. Trees maintain alignment through flexibility. Stress moves through them and exits without accumulation. Strength remains distributed. Branches sway together, not independently. Motion synchronizes gently, reducing strain through shared response. Leaves filter light without interruption. Illumination remains even, predictable, and soft. Contrast fades. Energy intake remains steady. Surplus disperses. Deficit draws gently from reserves. Nothing spikes. Animals remain present without imprint. Movement follows memory. Behavior stabilizes through familiarity. Encounters resolve without escalation. Spacing and timing suffice. Balance persists quietly. Sound continues to dissolve quickly. Vibrations lose definition as they pass through layered mass. Silence feels full. Temperature remains moderated by depth and density. Heat lingers. Cold settles gently then dissipates. Moisture clings lightly to surfaces. Air remains humid without heaviness. Water stays within reach. Beyond the forest, influence spreads invisibly. Surrounding systems slow slightly, aligning unconsciously with the forest's pace. Edges blur further. There is no moment where the forest begins or ends. Transition replaces boundary. At this scale, the forest no longer appears active. It simply remains. Its persistence shapes everything nearby without effort. There is no emphasis, no signal, no conclusion. Only continuation, steady, unmarked, and unhurried. The forest exists as a condition of slowness, extending through time without interruption. As the forest continues in this unbroken state, even contrast becomes unnecessary. Light and shadow exist together without separation. Warmth and coolness overlap gently, never asserting themselves. Nothing within the forest attempts to stand out. Variation exists, but it is evenly distributed. Differences soften before they become distinct. The forest no longer feels like a collection of elements. It feels like a single, continuous medium, one in which movement happens slowly enough to remain unnoticed. Energy passes through the system without pause. It enters, transforms, and exits along paths shaped by long familiarity. No accumulation becomes excessive. No loss becomes urgent. The ground remains quietly adaptive. It receives weight, disperses it, and releases it. Compression never becomes strain. Organic layers deepen gradually. Each addition settles into place without disruption. Older layers continue to support newer ones. Chemical balance persists through constant, minor exchange. No sharp signals form. Everything communicates softly. Roots continue their slow expansion and retreat. Direction changes are minimal. Progress occurs through alignment rather than effort. Below the surface, fungal pathways remain active yet unobtrusive. They reroute continuously, maintaining efficiency without visibility. Trees hold themselves upright through distributed strength. No single point bears the full burden. Stability emerges through sharing. Branches respond to air movement together. Motion becomes collective. Stress dissolves through synchronization. Leaves perform their function quietly. They appear, persist briefly, and withdraw without emphasis. The cycle repeats unchanged. Light continues to arrive filtered and softened. Brightness never overwhelms. Darkness never dominates. Photosynthesis proceeds steadily. Energy intake matches long-term availability rather than momentary abundance. Animals remain integrated into the flow. Their presence alters nothing permanently. Paths form, fade, and reform gently. Encounters resolve through spacing and timing. Conflict rarely escalates. Balance restores itself automatically. Sound remains diffuse. No noise lingers long enough to define space. Silence feels layered rather than empty. Temperature regulation continues without interruption. Heat stores in mass. Cold disperses through layers. Moisture remains present across surfaces. Air carries humidity evenly. Water stays close, never rushing away. Beyond the forest, subtle changes accumulate. Nearby systems slow. Extremes soften. Stability spreads quietly. Edges dissolve further. The forest transitions into its surroundings so gradually that distinction loses meaning. At this depth of persistence, the forest does not respond to change, it absorbs it. Disturbance becomes part of the ongoing pattern. There is no anticipation here. No reflection. No direction. Only steady presence, extended evenly across time. The forest remains not because it resists motion, but because it allows motion to occur slowly enough to remain whole. As the forest remains in this state of sustained calm, even the notion of observation begins to fade. There is nothing to watch unfold because unfolding itself has slowed beyond notice. Change occurs, but it is absorbed before it can be perceived. The forest no longer presents scenes. It presents continuity. Every part exists in quiet agreement with the rest, each allowing the others to remain unchanged. Time within the forest does not pass, it spreads. Moments overlap gently, erasing edges between before and after. What is happening now feels the same as what has always been happening. The ground continues its patient work. Pressure arrives, disperses, and vanishes. Surfaces retain softness without weakness. Stability remains elastic. Layers of organic matter deepen incrementally. Each layer settles into the ones below, forming a gradient rather than a boundary. Nothing is separate enough to be isolated. Decomposition continues as a background process. It does not signal decay. It signals availability. Material becomes ready for reuse without interruption. Chemical gradients remain shallow. Communication happens without urgency. Signals guide gently rather than instruct. Roots remain responsive without haste. They occupy space temporarily, then release it. Their presence is flexible, never fixed. Below, fungal pathways maintain connection without dominance. They expand where needed, recede where complete. Their motion leaves no trace. Trees stand not as individuals but as participants in a shared structure. Their spacing reflects long negotiation rather than competition. Trunks distribute stress through internal networks. Movement passes through them and exits quietly. No strain accumulates. Branches sway together, responding as a group rather than alone. Motion becomes cooperative, reducing effort. Leaves continue their quiet cycle. They arrive, filter light, and depart. Nothing about the process draws attention. Light enters the forest as a softened field. Brightness diffuses before reaching the ground. Contrast remains low and constant. Energy intake remains steady. Surplus never accumulates. Shortage never persists. Balance sustains itself. Animals move without imprint. Their paths are suggestions rather than marks. Presence remains temporary. Encounters resolve through familiarity. Space and timing maintain order without confrontation. Sound remains ambient. Vibrations pass through layers and dissolve. Silence feels continuous rather than empty. Temperature remains moderated by mass and depth. Warmth lingers. Coolness settles gently then fades. Moisture stays within reach. Air remains evenly humid. Water circulates slowly, never rushing. Beyond the forest, its influence continues outward. Nearby systems soften. Extremes lessen. Rhythm slows. Edges continue to blur. There is no line where the forest stops. Transition replaces boundary entirely. At this depth of persistence, the forest no longer functions as a place. It functions as a condition, one defined by slowness, balance, and quiet endurance. Nothing begins. Nothing ends. The forest continues evenly and without emphasis, extending through time as a single, uninterrupted presence. As this continuity persists, even the idea of permanence begins to soften. The forest does not aim to last. It simply continues because nothing within it urges an end. Existence here is not sustained through effort. It is sustained through alignment. Each process fits its surroundings well enough that no correction becomes necessary. The forest holds itself together by allowing everything to move just slowly enough. Motion never gathers momentum. Stillness never becomes rigid. Space remains evenly occupied. No region empties completely. No region becomes crowded. Distribution corrects itself before imbalance forms. The ground continues to receive and release pressure. It adapts without memory. Every step is new, yet nothing changes. Organic matter flows downward through stages of form, texture, and substance. Each transition occurs without boundary. Nothing disappears, it only changes role. Chemical conditions remain stable through constant dilution and replenishment. Extremes cannot form because nothing accumulates long enough. Roots continue to negotiate space quietly. They sense resistance early and redirect gently. Progress occurs through patience rather than force. Below, fungal systems persist as living corridors. They transport without storing, connect without centralization. Their presence remains subtle but essential. Trees maintain posture through distributed flexibility. No single fiber bears excessive load. Stress becomes shared, then released. Branches move together in air currents. Individual motion gives way to collective response. Strain dissolves into rhythm. Leaves appear in familiar density. Light passes through predictable layers. Brightness softens before it reaches the ground. Photosynthesis proceeds evenly. Energy intake matches long-term averages. There are no peaks, no deficits. Animals continue to pass through without altering structure. Their presence leaves no lasting mark. Paths exist only while needed. Encounters resolve through spacing and timing. Conflict rarely arises. Balance persists without enforcement. Sound remains diffuse. Vibrations lose shape as they travel. Silence feels full and continuous. Temperature remains moderated by mass, moisture, and depth. Heat enters slowly and leaves slowly. Cold behaves the same. Moisture remains suspended within the system. Evaporation slows. Condensation increases. Water stays present. Beyond the forest, subtle influence continues. Nearby systems adopt gentler rhythms. Extremes soften without awareness. Edges dissolve further. There is no transition point to observe. The forest merges gradually with everything around it. At this depth of endurance, the forest is no longer an ecosystem reacting to change. It is a medium through which change passes harmlessly. Nothing demands attention. Nothing invites interpretation. The forest remains, evenly distributed across time, quiet enough that even continuity feels effortless. There is no signal to continue. And yet it continues. As the forest remains in this unbroken state, even the sense of presence becomes lighter. It does not announce itself. It does not ask to be noticed. It simply exists, and in doing so gently alters everything around it. Nothing here requires interpretation. Meaning does not need to be extracted. The forest does not communicate through symbols or messages. It communicates through steadiness. Movement continues, but it is so evenly distributed that it feels like stillness. Leaves shift. Roots adjust. Moisture circulates. None of it interrupts the overall calm. The ground remains quietly receptive. It yields without giving way. It supports without resistance. Every contact is absorbed and released. Layers beneath the surface continue their slow exchange. Matter passes from one form to another without pause. Transition replaces transformation. There is no moment when something becomes finished. There is only gradual repositioning within the whole. Chemical conditions remain balanced through constant, minimal exchange. Nothing spikes. Nothing collapses. Stability holds without effort. Roots remain exploratory but restrained. They extend just enough, then settle. Their paths adjust continuously, guided by long familiarity. Fungal networks continue to serve as silent connectors. They do not store. They do not accumulate. They simply pass along what is needed, then move on. Trees remain upright through distributed resilience. They bend slightly, return slowly, and retain alignment. Strength remains invisible. Branches respond collectively to air currents. Motion becomes shared, reducing strain through cooperation. Leaves continue their cycle without variation. They emerge, filter light, and withdraw. The pattern repeats, unchanged and unremarkable. Light enters the forest softly. Brightness diffuses before reaching the ground. Shadows remain gentle and unbroken. Energy intake remains steady. There are no surges. There are no shortages. Balance sustains itself naturally. Animals move through without imprint. Their presence is temporary, their paths subtle. Nothing is altered for long. Encounters resolve without conflict. Space and timing provide all necessary structure. Sound remains ambient. Individual noises lose definition quickly. Silence feels layered and complete. Temperature remains moderated through mass and moisture. Warmth lingers. Coolness settles briefly then fades. Moisture continues to circulate slowly. Air remains evenly humid. Water stays close, never rushing away. Beyond the forest, its influence spreads quietly. Nearby systems slow slightly. Extremes soften without explanation. Edges continue to dissolve. The forest does not end. It transitions so gradually that distinction disappears. At this depth of continuity, the forest is no longer experienced as a place. It becomes a condition of calm persistence. Nothing begins here. Nothing concludes. The forest continues, evenly and without emphasis, allowing time to stretch without direction. And in that stretching, everything rests. As the forest persists in this state of quiet continuity, even the idea of movement becomes abstract. Things do move, but not in ways that can be easily separated from stillness. Motion and rest overlap until they feel like the same condition. Nothing here accelerates. Nothing slows deliberately. Every process simply finds its natural pace and remains there. The forest no longer appears dynamic or static. It exists in a steady middle state where change is constant but unremarkable. The ground continues its slow accommodation of matter. Weight arrives, spreads outward, and disappears. No compression remains long enough to harden. Organic layers settle gently into one another. Older material supports newer material without distinction. Everything belongs equally to the present. Decomposition proceeds without urgency. Material becomes simpler, then useful again. No phase is emphasized over another. Chemical balance remains shallow and wide. Gradients never sharpen. Signals remain soft, sufficient only to guide gradual adjustment. Roots continue their patient presence beneath the surface. They occupy space briefly then release it. Direction shifts occur without resistance. Fungal pathways remain active but understated. They connect without central focus, redistribute without accumulation, and fade where no longer needed. Trees hold form through shared resilience. Stress moves through their structure and exits without pause. Nothing strains long enough to fail. Branches respond together to air currents. Individual motion dissolves into collective rhythm. Effort spreads evenly. Leaves continue their quiet exchange with light. They filter, soften, and diffuse illumination before allowing it through. Contrast fades naturally. Photosynthetic activity remains consistent. Energy intake aligns with long-term conditions, never responding sharply to momentary change. Animals move as temporary patterns rather than permanent features. Their paths exist only while used, then soften and disappear. Encounters resolve through spacing and timing alone. No dominance is required. Balance remains intact. Sound continues to lose definition quickly. Vibrations disperse through layers of mass and texture. Silence remains full. Temperature holds steady through depth and moisture. Heat and coolness move slowly, never concentrating. Water remains present across surfaces. Evaporation and condensation balance gently. Moisture lingers. Beyond the forest, influence continues outward. Surrounding systems adopt slower rhythms. Extremes soften without recognition. Edges dissolve further. There is no clear transition from forest to elsewhere. Continuity replaces separation. At this depth of persistence, the forest no longer responds to time. It simply allows time to pass through without disturbance. Nothing here marks a moment as special. Nothing stands apart. The forest continues as an even field of presence, unbroken and unhurried. Change passes through quietly, and nothing needs to follow.